So here we are in Unit 2, and this is our first foray into antiquity. We are going to be talking about the very earliest music that was written down, and this started somewhere around 400 AD. And really basically what happened is we had the fall of the Roman Empire. And when Rome fell, it left a really big hole. It left a vacuum in most of Western Europe, where people had to decide who was going to rule over their area or, their particular group of people, because people became very isolated without the Roman Empire. There was no way to really get a lot of information disseminated over a large area anymore. So it became more of a tribal way of ruling. And so for really from about 400 AD to about 12 or 1300 AD, we have these smaller ruling classes, these groups of people that have to learn all over again how to trade with other groups of people, who is friend, who is foe, how to set boundary lines, who owns what country. So all of these things are really happening over quite a few hundred years. So the early part of our journey really has to do with sacred music. It was the music of the church that was being written down at that time, more than any sort of secular music at all. So at first we're going to be delving into mostly church music. As we get into the second half of the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, we will see that we do have a rise of culture. We have the age of exploration that's coming of age. We see the rise of university. We see kings like Charlemagne who actually this is a picture of Charlemagne right here, and he wanted to learn to read and write. He wanted scribes to teach him. He was actually a king. It seems hard to believe that the ruling class didn't know how to read and write, but that was absolutely the truth back then. Very few people knew how to read and write. So it was really the monks in the church and the scribes that did most of the education of anyone during this particular time. And we see that this bust of Charlemagne, about 1350, was really about the time that we had the rise of a more secular and educated upper class and middle class. With that comes the rise of a more educated base, and therefore we have more secular music that starts to be written down for the first time. So this is when we begin really understanding and knowing more about what people were doing in their daily lives that revolved around music, rather than only what was used as worship in the church. While we talk about in the early Middle Ages, the church was the biggest patron of the arts, as we move into the Renaissance, we will see here that we have this rise of the merchant class that I was talking about with the age of exploration, allows us to have the first grouping of amateur musicians, which then allows composers to try out and really broaden their horizons as far as what types of music that they want to perform. They are not only performing sacred music for the church. The church is not the only one that's paying their bills, so to speak, anymore. So as we move into the Renaissance, we see a rise in the secular music, and we'll be talking in chapters 13 through 19 not only about what kind of sacred music was being composed at this time, but also what was being done outside of the church. Now, chapter 13 really deals with our early music that I was talking about, really, that starts in about 400 AD. Now, they talk about sung worship as being a shared feature among different cultures, but what was interesting at this time is most of the worship music that we hear, that we're going to be discovering, was mostly sung by men in the church. As a matter of fact, nuns were not allowed to sing in public. So in our Western culture at this time, the religious communities, the monasteries that we see here, they had the extensive development of worship music, but what was really done at this time is quite interesting. We don't really hear about a whole lot of diversification in the world of the church, with the exception of Hildegard of Bingen, which I'm going to talk about here in just a moment. So the early music of the church was something that we call plain chant. Some people might call it Gregorian chant. You may have heard that. I reference it this way at sometimes. It's really because of a guy, a pope, his name is Pope Gregory, who decided it was a great idea to start codifying music. So he is credited with the edict to begin to write down music for the first time. So that's why sometimes people call this plain chant Gregorian chant. Now here are those three terms that I was telling you about in Unit 1. The chant melodies fall into three categories, and it has to do with how many syllables of text or how many notes you're getting per syllable of text. And we have these three designations here. We have syllabic, which is one note per syllable, pneumatic, which is several notes per syllable, and melismatic, which is many notes per syllable. And you may remember this. I gave you that example from the Hallelujah Chorus that tells us, shows us many different styles here. It took many years to codify this early music, and one of the interesting things about taking all those generations to be able to put this music down on paper is the idea of the preservation of knowledge. Knowledge became paramount during this time. Very few people really got out of even their small township. So this preservation of knowledge, being able to pass this on from one generation to the next, became extremely important to the church to make sure that future generations were able to build upon the knowledge of these early chants. Like I said, plain chant is really our earliest form of music. It is a single line melody. It only has one line of music. We call that monophonic. It doesn't have a meter, and that's what makes this so hard for students to follow today. It really follows directly whatever words are being said at the time. So the Latin text really kind of dictates what the meter is going to be, so it's very free-flowing. This idea of liturgy is an order of a church service. Now, if you're Catholic, you know that we still have a liturgy today, and it's a very set, structured way to go to church. It's not free-flowing. Everything has a place and everything has a time, and that stems all the way back from this time period. Now, Pope Gregory was the one I talked about that was originally credited with putting this edict out to start to codify all this music, but it took quite a long time. But most often we do call it Gregorian chant, but we're trying to move over to the idea of plain chant now because we're not entirely sure what Pope Gregory did back in the day, but he is generally credited with starting the process of codifying all this music. One of the things I really want to point out here with this early music, I want you to look at this piece of art here. We can see through this early artwork that the art is two-dimensional. It seems very flat. There doesn't seem to be a lot of perspective here. The faces seem two-dimensional. It looks like it was done on a wall or on a piece of paper rather than more of a picture like I was describing to you in Unit 1. And we will see that this is also the case in music. Music seems very two-dimensional at this stage in the game because at this point, we don't even know how to put two lines of music together. Harmony hasn't even been invented yet. So we are at the very early stages of music, and we're going to do a little bit of listening with Hildegard of Bingen here so that we can hear really how monophonic and simple this music is at this time period. So I want to talk a little bit about Hildegard of Bingen and listen to a piece of plain chant that we wrote that's actually listening guide 2 in your text. But the thing that fascinates me about her is that, first of all, she's a published author from 1100 AD, which is nearly unheard of, especially for a woman at this time. And the other interesting thing about her is that her parents did indeed give her to the church as a tithe. She was the 8th of 10 children. Her parents were aristocratic, and it seems absolutely crazy to me to give a child away as a tithe. We just could not imagine that. It's not part of our culture today. So it really fascinates me, really about her life. She did have a number of visions. The visions are really credited by migraine headaches. However, for whatever reason, that became a miracle for her. And she wrote a number of books. One was on medicine. She had a book of poetry. She has several books of music. And she really led a very interesting life and was highly revered in the church. This is a picture of her, although, of course, it's highly stylized. We don't actually know what she looked like, but, and she was sainted, too, by the church, which is really quite remarkable at that time. So let's take a listen to a little bit of plain chant. It's very odd sounding to our ears. Probably it's reminiscent of some sort of movie music of a period piece of the time. It's not something we hear a lot unless you're in the Catholic Church. Sometimes a cantor will begin one of the parts of the liturgy with one of these early chant introductions here like this. So let's take a quick listen to what this actually sounds like. Here's that Alleluia. We can hear that it is very melismatic. We have a lot of notes on one syllable. It's going to go on here and give us more text as we continue on. And I'm going to let you spend the time to listen to the rest of this. It is very calming in a lot of ways. It's something called modal. It's not in the key structure that we would know today. So that also is a little off-putting and strange sounding to our ears. Like I said, unless you're Catholic, then you may be somewhat familiar with some of these tones. But it is definitely almost like a foreign language to us, both in the text and in the way the music actually sounds. But this is really what early music sounded like at the time. They were very familiar with music like this during this time period. The next thing I want to mention is in chapter 14, and this is something called organum or early polyphony. Remember, polyphony means more than one melody being sung at the same time. So this is the most valuable contribution that these early composers have ever given us. This is the rise of harmony. For the first time, people have to figure out how music works together. What happens when I put this note with this note? Does it sound good? Does it sound bad? Now, one of the interesting things about this early music is some of the intervals, some of the way the notes interplay with each other were considered to be pleasant to their ears at that time, but yet they seem hollow and a bit unpleasant to us in our modern tonality system. So what we hear may not be as pleasant as what they would have experienced at that time. Early polyphony has a name, it's called organum, which is where you would take this original Gregorian chant melody, like what we just heard with Hildegard of Bingen, and you would place it very slowly, sort of one note at a time, on the bottom of the piece of music. And then we add usually 2, sometimes 3 more lines on top of that where the music moves much faster. So it's almost like a dirge of this Gregorian melody or a drone underneath with a couple of voices being added to it. We are going to take a listen because this is our next listening guide here, this chapter 14, the Gauda Maria Virgo. And we can see here, here's that Gregorian chant that's at the bottom. It's kind of one long note, followed by a couple of notes that are in a similar rhythm. Again, it's not metered because it's going by the Latin text here rather than by any sort of given rhythm. And it's put together with these 2 lines here above the bottom line. I'm going to let you, actually we'll take a quick listen to this before my time is up here. So we can hear how hollow and different and unusual this music sounds at this time.